Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Micah Jones, an assistant professor of history and Black studies at the University of Oregon. Professor Jones's interests include race, the civil rights movement, consumerism, consumer activism, gender, the U.S. South, and 20th century African American history. Prior to joining the university faculty in fall of 2025, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia from 2023 to 2025. Micah Jones, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your background.
So I grew up in Georgia, so I'm a Southerner, which I think it shows up in the research interests. I grew up outside of Atlanta, and then I went to Yale for both undergrad and grad. And while I was there, I sort of got really interested in the history of the civil rights movement, and sort of for my senior thesis, wrote about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the role of gender in it. And I just sort of remember thinking at the end of that process, like, I'm not done with this. I was thinking at the time, oh, I'm going to become a lawyer. And I remember thinking sort of, I'm not done with this. I'm going to miss my JSTOR access. And that being the kind of moment of like, okay, maybe if you're mourning access to JSTOR, it might be time to go to graduate school.
I share that deep love for the JSTOR access, 2 a.m, you're like, but I could read that other essay.
Exactly.
What led to your interest in a career in academia? I mean, I gather that it was JSTOR, but I have to imagine it was more than that.
I think it was a combination of things. So as I said, I was at the time that I was in undergrad, I was thinking I wanted to become an attorney. And I sort of had two experiences that made it clear to me that that was not the case. One was that I had a really, really wonderful experience as a legal intern for a nonprofit in St. Louis. And it was amazing, but it was also the moment that I realized that I wasn't meant to do sort of client-facing work. It was really hard to sort of let go at the end of the day of what was sort of, we were having folks who were being incarcerated simply for lack of access to funding to pay off traffic tickets. And I just sort of, at the end of the day, couldn't shake it off. I was interested in this racial justice work, but it was a realization that I need to do this with people in the past and events that are sort of not over by any means, but not as active in a way. And then the other experience that I had is that I worked for a summer as a research assistant for a professor who's writing a book on race and the law. And I had I loved it. I was in the library all day, every day, researching. And I remember thinking, like, this lawyer thing is amazing. And then I realized what I actually liked about that experience was getting to do this really deep dive into African American history. And then, like I said, I wrote a senior thesis and really enjoyed that process. So it's just everything kept being like quietly like, what you actually like is telling stories. What you actually like is doing research. And so that kind of came together. And eventually I went to my mentors and I was like, I think I want to be a historian. They were like, we all know. Waiting for you to know. Yeah.
What a great story. So tell us about your dissertation.
Mm-hmm. So my dissertation, which I'm currently working to turn into a monograph, is about Black shoppers in the 20th century South. So I kind of think of the project as having sort of two scopes. One is that we have this sort of really wonderful body of research on how retail stores and the experience of shopping in the US context is changing in the 20th century. But what we know less about is how Black shoppers are experiencing that. So part of what the work of the project does is it looks at things like the emergence of chain stores in the early 20th century, which is a time where they're growing and spreading, and the emergence of things like paying for goods and cash. And it thinks about how that impacted Black consumers in particular and specifically. And then the other side of the project is sort of thinking about how Black people are relating to this sort of identity of shopper and consumer. So the 20th century United States is a place that's becoming an increasingly consumerist and consumption-centric economy, but also culture. And Black people are experiencing incredible racial discrimination and also a lot of violence while shopping in stores. And it becomes this key way in which people are measuring their kind of exclusion from US society is that they're not able to fully partake in this really essential part of what it means to be American in the 20th century, which is to shop and have access to this sort of bounty and this particular consumer experience. And so the project sort of tracks how their efforts to sort of get access to equitable shopping experience, often through boycotting, picketing, and other sort of consumer actions.
Interesting. What was the title of the dissertation? And does the book have the same title?
Yes, so it's The Price of Freedom, Race Consumption, and the Long Black Freedom Struggle.
And is it centered primarily in the 20th century? Or does it move into the 21st and sort of the increasingly digital environment we're in?
It's mostly about 1915 to 1970, so
Hmm.
mostly a Jim Crow era story. I think
Mm.
it definitely has sort of implications for our sort of contemporary moment. Part of what I think about and look at is that when we think about the Jim Crow South, we think about segregation often. But places like grocery stores, which come up sort of a lot in the work, are not actually necessarily segregated. There are certainly some that serve a predominantly Black or predominantly white customer base, but a lot of times people actually are shopping in the same stores, sometimes at the same time. And so there's definitely racism, but it doesn't look like segregation in the way that we imagine it. And so part of what the work is doing for me is both asking us to think about race in the Jim Crow South beyond this question of segregation, but also the ways that this sort of foreshadows a post Jim Crow moment. That what's going to happen is as we get rid of this kind of legal and social regime of Jim Crow, that like race is going to look a lot more like it looks in stores than it has sort of the kind of strict spatial division of segregation.
Oh, really interesting.
Thank you.
Um, who has inspired you? What are some of the models that you're following here?
Hmm. In terms of scholarship or in terms of uh,
Whichever
more
one you
work?
feel like talking about.
I think in terms of scholarship, one of the people who most inspires me, and this will be unsurprising, is my dissertation advisor, a woman named Crystal Feenster, Professor Crystal Feenster. And I think one of the things that I so admire about her work is just her close attentiveness to how different factors of identity shape people's experience. So her own work looks a lot at sexual violence and gender-based violence. And it's not something that you would necessarily imagine. When I say, I write about stores and shopping, gender-based violence is not sort of where people's minds first goes. But one of the things that comes up a lot in my stories is, or in the stories that I tell in the book, is Black women who go to shop in a grocery store and encounter or experience really intense acts of violence at the hands of white clerks. And sort of thinking through those moments. So one is a woman named Vivian Whitehead, and she's in a grocery store in Atlanta in the 1930s, and she gets into an argument about the grocery clerk about picking out a vegetable. She wants to pick it out herself. He doesn't want to let her. And he physically slaps her, he attacks her. And so I think that in my work, in ways that are not always sort of obvious from the outside, builds with my advisor's work and sort of draws on it to think about how this is a moment that's not just shaped by sort of race, but is also about assertion of a kind of gender-based authority and a white patriarchy in this context of the South that is influencing what we might first think of as a relationship between customer and clerk is actually also a relationship between white masculinity and Black womanhood and violence and the kind of public sphere. And so I think that sort of her work inspires mine in that way. And I kind of build on that model of sort of attentiveness of how that kind of comes to bear on Black shoppers' experiences.
No, that is really, really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your teaching. Tell us what classes you teach at the University of Oregon.
Yeah, so I teach a variety of classes. So one that I really enjoy is sort of drawn from the research. It's called Shopping While Black, and it sort of looks very broadly at Black consumers' experiences in the 20th century US context. So things ranging from, shopping in grocery stores to sports and sort of the consumption of sort of Black athletes and that experience and that role. So it really ranges broadly. I'm currently teaching a class on the civil rights movement, which is exciting. And so we're going kind of very a long vision of it. So from the founding of the NAACP in the early 20th century all the way to the Black Panthers at mid-century. So really thinking about kind of the variety of different tactics and goals and sort of arguments that people are making about how the civil rights movement should be structured, and how we achieve racial justice and equity. And then I also teach both halves of the African American History Survey. So the first half being to emancipation, and then the second half being from emancipation to present.
And how do you approach teaching history?
Hmm. I think one of the main things for me is that I always want, in whatever the context of the class or the structure of the class, I always want students to be having access to primary sources, and to be working with them sort of right away. I think it's one of the kind of best skills that we can impart to our students as historians, whether they want to work in the field as historians or whatever they do, because what we're asking is for people to sort of pay close attention, to read a sort of document or a song or a painting really carefully and to come up with sort of your own perspective on what it means. And then to take that document and to use it to craft arguments. So I give you a secondary source that gives you some historical context. I give you a primary source and I ask you both to sort of read it and to glean new information about history from it, but also to put it in conversation with what people have already said. And I think this skill set of being able to evaluate and assess evidence, to put it in conversation with arguments and information that people have already gathered, is one that will be useful to students, whatever they choose to do next. You're going to be asked to sort of think logically, to handle and sort of make use of information and evidence, and to make persuasive arguments. And so I think it's just a fundamental skill that history courses can help offer students.
Do you ever incorporate, visits to special collections or archives, or do you bring materials in? How do you make that experience for students?
It's a little both. So
Hmm.
I taught in the winter quarter, I taught African American history, emancipation to present. And one of the things that we did is that there was a traveling exhibit at the Schnitzer Museum of Art that was on a Black political cartoonist named Ollie Harrington. So the exhibit was called Dark Laughter Revisited. And so Harrington is this sort of really long-lived and active political cartoonist. He lives, it's like 1912 to like he lives a very long time and he's working and active for a very long time. And so towards the end of the course, we went to go see the sort of exhibit on his art. And it was this wonderful kind of combination of a kind of review, because he's working in such a long period in sort of post-emancipation African American history. It was like, well, do you remember when we talked about that? And then we see it in the art and the political commentary. And I think it was also just sort of a lovely experience for the students to get out of the classroom. And for those of
Hmm.
them that were more inclined towards like art and visual media than sort of all the
Hmm.
writing and reading that we do, to kind of see it portrayed. And so it was nice to be able to kind of introduce them, for some of them who are more sort of early in their journey here at UO, just the resources on the university and the campus, and to just also have access to that, because it really drove home in this really fun, interesting way what we had been talking about, and I think demonstrated to them what that material would allow them to do, in a different way than just being in the classroom.
So great. I'm so happy that you do that. I'm like you, I'm so struck by the resources we have on this campus, and it's so exciting that we get to use them. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's wonderful. Why is it important, do you think, for students to learn about his history?
Hmm. I think it's important, I would say, for sort of two sets of reason. One that I think students come in with the notion of, which is that I think that it helps us to understand our contemporary moment, particularly like a lot of the materials that I'm working with that are especially recent, I think help contextualize for students. So just the other day in my long civil rights class, we were talking about how we got the Voting Rights Act. and what the history was. So we read about Fannie Lou Hamer, who's a Mississippi-based civil rights activist, and we read this sort of really affecting account of her efforts to register to vote in Mississippi in the 1960s, and sort of all of the violence she experienced as a part of her activism. She is given a literacy test. She is required to pay a poll tax. And so we see, and she's fired from her job, which she's a sharecropper, so it's also her home. And so then we see all of these challenges that she faced to vote. And then we talk about the Voting Rights Act, and we talk about sort of how it intervened in these things and made it possible, not right away, not magically, but that it was a real turning point that gave people access to the ballot. And then we talked about recent events around sort of court cases related to the Voting Rights Act and this sense of a shift away. And so part of the discussion in class was like, does the Voting Rights Act still feel relevant? Have we moved past this? To what degree? How would we know? And so that for me is like, there's a real way in which history helps us contextualize these things, because on the surface, you hear about that, and it means less if you don't sort of know this history and know in this really kind of textured way what happened. But and how we got here. But I think also the thing that maybe sometimes is less obvious for students that I want sometimes is to let the past be alien and odd. I think that sometimes we have this urge to sort of look in history to find people who are experiencing exactly what we're experiencing in the way that we're experiencing it. But I think part of what history can do is really trouble our assumptions about what is natural, what's inherent, what's normal. It can help us think about things like identity and sexuality, the terms of which have changed a lot over time, the terms people use for themselves, the way that they understand the connection between something like sex, gender, sexuality, race looks very different over time. And it's not to say that we can't identify with people in the past or want to sort of see some overlaps between their very human experience and our own, but I think it unsettles sort of some notions that can feel very obvious and natural and inherent, and asks us to really think about what it means to be sort of like a person in the world and to relate to people in a way that is different than if we just come at it from a contemporary perspective.
Thank you for that. So, what attracted you to the University of Oregon?
I think one of the main things that attracted me was this sense that it was a place where I could both be really invested in my teaching and really invested in my scholarship. And I think when you look at universities, sometimes you find places that are really invested in the scholarship, but the discourse around teaching can be less enthused and less engaged. And sometimes you find places where people are absolutely enthused about the teaching, but sometimes that comes sort of at the expense of the scholarship. And I think one of the things that really struck me here when I was speaking with my now colleagues, but then potential future colleagues, was the sense that they took both really, really seriously. And I'm getting to know people in other departments, but I'm most familiar with the history department. And I just think in conversations with my colleagues, there was this real love and investment in good, sound pedagogy that I really, really liked. And it has borne out in being here that I have colleagues who want to talk about how to teach better, who are invested in student success and want to have conversations and trade ideas about, okay, well, I have tried like starting class with music and that has gotten us off to sort of a good energetic start. Or like maybe discussion posts don't work in the age of AI. So like, what are we doing instead to check in about reading? So being able to have those kinds of tips and tricks conversations has been really wonderful. But at the same time, are people who share a just love of learning, just a love of getting to be in the research and do the research. And the reason I got into the job, into the profession, is because I love both. Like I love teaching, but I love researching as well. And there's only 24 hours in the day. So sometimes they're in a little bit of a competition, but I think that they feed each other. And I got the real sense this is a place that sees it that way.
I'm really glad to hear that. That's good to know. I feel the same way, and it's just nice to hear that that's carrying on
Yeah,
in the culture now. Thank you so much for your time today.
yeah, thank you. This has been lovely. It's nice that this is a thing that happens.
We like it too. I have been speaking with Micah Jones, Assistant Professor of History and Black Studies at the University of Oregon. Our Research Notes segment helps us keep current on recent developments in University of Oregon faculty and student humanities research, such as the book we will be discussing today, Data Equals, Democratic Equality and Technological Hierarchy by Colin Koopman, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2025. Colin Koopman is professor of philosophy at the University of Oregon, where he is also the director of the New Media and Culture Certificate Program. Professor Koopman's interests include political philosophy, information politics and data ethics, social impacts of AI, history of philosophy, genealogy, and pragmatism. Colin, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of Oregon Humanities Center, and it's a delight to be here.
Tell us more about your research focus.
So, my research is primarily grounded in the discipline of philosophy, and two things that have sort of always drawn me in philosophy and very much kept me in it are the tendency in philosophy for it to be fair game for everything to be on the table. So this is one thing I love about philosophy is there's no kind of um, set of assumptions at the outset that a certain methodology or a certain topic is off the table and like not part of what we do over here in anthropology when we're studying culture or society when we're in sociology. Really, like everything's on the table is one thing. Um, and another aspect of philosophy that I really love is that philosophy really prides itself on trying to like find the hardest problem, finding the hardest problem with something, finding the most difficult topic, be it a topic in political philosophy, which is where I mostly do my work, or in epistemology or theory of knowledge. But finding these spaces where it's just really difficult to grasp, at least at the outset, like what is the right way to proceed here? What's the right answer, right? So when we think about some topic in political philosophy of technology, which is really where the sort of the center of my work is, in terms of my subfield, we have all these concerns about data privacy and mass surveillance, right? And it's just not immediately and abundantly clear to us like what to do about these views. It's not clear, when we have an interest in privacy or a right to privacy, what is the content of that interest? What is the content of that right? And what actually justifies it, right? There are so many different moral frameworks, political frameworks from which you might think about a justification for privacy. And things instantly, or not instantly, but like very quickly, the problem begins to spiral and becomes this like very difficult knot of like thinking about how do we actually justify this intuitive reaction I have about these like mega corporations sucking up all my data or all the data of our, school kids, right? There's like an intuitive rejection of that. But then when we actually sort of go and try to like make the case, it turns out it's like a very difficult, hard issue. So I love philosophy that like in the way that it like puts on the table the work of homing in on those really difficult, those hard issues.
And then tell us about data equals, democratic equality, and technological hierarchy.
So this book came out back in the fall, so about 6 or 7 months ago. And at the core concern of the book is encapsulated in a phrase that appears on the first page. So the opening thought tries to bring into view two simultaneous phenomena that are very central to to present day life. So the line is this: democracy totters, yet data prospers. So we're simultaneously in this situation where our democratic ways of life are tottering and teetering and feeling a little bit unstable in ways that think are going to be obvious to your listeners. And at the same time, there's this sort of mega prosperity in data that has really been persisting for the last, off and on, boom bust cycles like 30 years. And now we're in the midst of the latest version of it, which is the immense prosperity that's promised by and is certainly being cashed in by some on Wall Street and AI, right? Um, so the book makes the argument that this simultaneity of democracy tottering and data prospering is not accidental, that there's an intimate connection between our ability or increasing inability to relate to one another as democratic equals, as fellow citizens who can see each other kind of, again, across the aisle, across all kinds of familiar divides, as equals with one another. The difficulty of doing that increases as we load more and more of our lives, and as more and more of our lives gets loaded for us onto social media platforms, other aspects of data technology, um, and gets filtered through algorithms that do this remarkably impressive, from a non-political, non-social point of view, remarkably impressive work of filtering people, sorting people, basketing, categorizing people in ways that create all these opportunities for social separation, right? And political polarization, with which we're all familiar. This is just, I think, sort of one instance or iteration of this sort of more deeper underlying social separation. It's also manifests in other ways in the context of, say, the loneliness epidemic that's really running across liberal democracies today. And the kind of fundamental concern in the book is with this social separation insofar as, it certainly has many causes, but again, the remarkable efficiency of data technology at basketing us and categorizing us into these, separate silos where we find it difficult to interact with people who are in important ways, especially for a democracy, are in important ways different from us. And a kind of watchword for this that I discuss in the book, primarily in the context of education, but with which all viewers, all listeners, sorry, will be familiar, is personalization, right? And I mentioned viewers there because I'm thinking of the prime example of this is Netflix, right? I mean, we're all aware of the personalizing algorithms on our streaming platforms that we subscribe to that give us these personalized recommendations. And maybe in like the context of consumer media consumption, this personalization has its place. I'm not sure. I don't really engage that. I am a little skeptical about that. But if I have skepticism there, it's because of this bigger case where it operates in ways that are, I think, manifestly pernicious, which would be the context of education. So one of the primary implementations of personalization and personalizing data technology over the last 15 years has been in education, especially K-12 education, though this is something that also happens on our campus here at University of Oregon and higher ed nationwide. The K-12 cases are a little bit easier to see. But what it manifests in this case is think of your average elementary school classroom where students are, given a certain part of the day that's tablet time. And what does tablet time look like? It looks like all the students sort of sitting next to one another, but staring into their separate personalized devices, each of which they've logged into. And those devices are busy personalizing their education content, curricula, sequencing, etc. So that on this sort of like, you sort of roll this out a few generations of software, not a few generations of students. So this is coming in, just a few years at most. You're going to have classrooms of 30 kids or, arguably with budget cuts, like 40, 50 kids that are run by students staring into tablets, which are providing them with content that are different from all the other students in the room. Right. And what you lose here are two things. You lose both like common points of interaction, like common points of understanding, where students can then go out at recess and, talk about like this wild fact about like sharks. But you also lose collaboration in learning, right? Learning becomes this highly separate, individualized process where learning is modeled and understood and then enacted as like something that I do by myself on my tablet, where I have my user account and my license and I've logged in, and that's just what learning is. That's what it looks like. And in that context of personalization, scaling up from like Netflix, movie algorithms and Amazon shopping algorithms now to education and other domains, healthcare, et cetera, we get these social domains that are increasingly encroached upon in ways where there's just less and less opportunities, fewer and fewer opportunities for people in those domains to collaborate with one another. And where they lose that opportunity for collaboration, they lose skills in practice at and in actual instantiation of democratic equality, which is really the sort of fundamental concern of the book, is democracy is at bottom a collaborative endeavor of self-government, of reflexive self-government. We're all working together on this thing, even though sometimes it doesn't seem that way, and especially now in the midst of a tottering democracy, it doesn't seem that way. That democracy is this like joint project that we all have of collaborating together to make the laws, to make the policies that in virtue of which we have a well-ordered society where people can come together and expect a relative degree modicum of stability, right? Um, but if we're now a democracy with an education system that is increasingly not affording opportunities for students to develop those skills, that's highly concerning to me, right? And I think it should be highly concerning to all of us. So there are many aspects to the bigger story of democratic polarization and social separation. And what I'm really concerned with in this book is this one aspect that, through which I think a number of the other aspects are being increasingly threaded, and that's our data.
Hmm. No, yeah, this sounds like an urgent issue, and I'm glad that you've been writing about it. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Of course, you've been pointing in this direction, but we like to give people the opportunity to just state it frankly. What makes this topic important to humanity?
Yeah, I mean, my work is fundamentally rooted in humanistic concerns with well-lived lives and flourishing lives, and trying to understand how we can have and even enjoy at times well-lived lives in contexts of highly industrialized, highly complicated modern societies like those that we live in today, where I mean, there's all kinds of industrial technology, and even post-industrial technology that increasingly organizes the very terms of our humanity, that increasingly organizes how we can or cannot be related to one another. Um, I think of democracy as itself a kind of fundamentally like humanistic concern, a fundamentally humanistic issue, that we all, as it were, like ought to care about just in virtue of being human, in terms of democracy being a way that speaks to our possibility for being organized, so that again we can relate to each other as equals, so that we can see eye to eye to with our fellow neighbor, so that we can understand ourselves as mutual collaborators on projects of self-government that we may be involved in. And maybe I'll just kind of mention a phrase for this that's actually the first quote in the book. And it's a quote from Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which, of course, for readers or listeners who don't know it, is her, very chilling account of the rise of totalitarianism in Central Europe in the earlier parts of the 20th century. And she has this phrase toward the end of the book, where she talks about what she calls organized loneliness. And this phrase, I think, speaks to both the political concern with democratic destabilization that's at the heart of my book, right? How politics and social structures are organizing us in ways where we're increasingly separated from one another. And her phrase, I mean, it's such a beautiful phrase. A colleague of mine, back when the book was being written, suggested, well, maybe that should be your title, right? Organized loneliness. And in some ways, like that is the core idea, because there's also that phrase. What I also love about it is that it not just speaks to the politics of democratic deterioration, which is so concerning, but it also speaks to like the very human core of that, right? It
Hmm.
speaks to the way in which that democratic destabilization, it's not just about, right, having like reliable social systems around us, reliable healthcare systems, reliable banking systems, right? Reliable like employment and labor relations, all of which are like important in a industrial and post-industrial democratic society, but also speaks to the human core of that in terms of like our very human desire and I think also need for connection with one another and our very human, like this sort of core part of us that like wants to and needs to not be lonely. And that connection that we have, that we can sometimes have with one another, that's a fundamental importance. And it takes many different shapes. It assumes many different forms. And the form I argue that it assumes in the political realm is democracy, right? So democracy just is what connection actually looks like when we're organized in such a way that we're no longer lonely when we're connected. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book is like take that term connection back from somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, right? The whole promise of Facebook was that it would connect us, right? And this is like the mission statement. And the great irony of big tech is that every promise that it makes, it actually delivers on the opposite, right? Facebook promises to connect us, it actually separates us, right? It promises to bring us together, it actually makes us lonely. Um, so the argument that I'm trying to sort of bring into view here is thinking again about how that destabilization or that the felt unease that we have around democracy right now is very much caught up in these promises that big tech has been making that it's delivering on its opposites.
Thank you so much for this. Where can our listeners learn more about these topics?
So, I mean, of course, listeners could check out the book. Again, it's titled Data Equals Democratic Equality and Technological Hierarchy, available through your favorite personalized consumer outlet. But maybe another, for anybody who's listening who's a New York Times subscriber, in the midst of writing the book, I was interviewed in the Times by David Marchese in a piece that I think they ended up titling "Your Data is Diminishing Your Freedom." And one thing I kind of love about that piece is the irony of the title. So yeah, I had no say in the title, but one of the arguments of the book actually is that yes, there are all these problems that are really like liberty problems and freedom problems with respect to our data and our datafication, and those problems are important. But I argue those problems also have our attention. And the fact that somebody at the time sort of sought to, or, decided to title this segment as one that's about freedom is kind of telling at this because the titler knew that like, well, this will catch eyeballs because people are concerned about how data tech is infringing on their freedom. And again, like, so that problem has our attention. And what I argue in the piece and in that interview, ironically, is that there's this other problem that we really need to attend to, which is the equality problem, the separation problem, and the loneliness problem,
Hmm.
and the extent to which democracy is being frayed by data, which is not a concern that, you or I ought to have about our individual freedom. It's rather a concern we ought to have, again, about our standing as democratic equals and the freedom that all of us in a democratic society ostensibly, ought to have and ought to have rights to. So again, that piece is titled "Your Data is Diminishing Your Freedom." I would retitle it "Your Data is Diminishing Democracy," or "Their Data is Diminishing Democracy." But in any event, it was in the Times in the last couple of years. So
We'll find the link and we'll put it up in the show notes so that people can access it. And in the meantime, I think it's time for another interview then, another Times interview.
that would be wonderful.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
I've been speaking with Colin Koopman, author of Data Equals, Democratic Equality and Technological Hierarchy, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2025. UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.